just want to say hello, welcome to the Fkthry podcast. And today we have a super special guest, a longtime hero of mine, if you will. I'll leave the fanboying to a minimum, but we've got the amazing Mr. Bill.
Nice.
Hell yeah. Thanks for coming, man.
Yeah, of course. Thanks for having me.
Yeah. So, we don't really want to think of this as like strictly an interview by any means. Like we have some questions sort of just to kind of get the ball rolling, but feel free to just take tangents and talk about whatever, because we're mostly just interested in your thought process and just the, general feelings and things about production and music in general. So we can kind of just riff on whatever comes up.
Cool.
So yeah, I guess classic question. This is probably the one you've heard the most times out of everything that you've recorded. But I am curious, what is your history with music? And like, did you have any training or did you do anything like prior to beginning production?
So I just played guitar mostly, I think, is like how I know most of the stuff I know about music. So before I got into electronic music, I was primarily a guitarist. I also played drums as well. Like my brother was a drummer, so there was always a drum kit in my house. So I was like playing drums sometimes, but I wouldn't consider myself a drummer. I was definitely more of a guitar player. And so I just played a lot of guitar. I didn't actually ever really learn music theory so much. I got guitar lessons for a while though from this guy called Jan Loopy, which is a really good guitar player from Sydney. And yeah, that's pretty much it. I mean, like most of what I know about music now is still translated from the stuff that I learned then, and then stuff that I've just sort of figured out along the way, I guess, since getting into electronic music production.
Sweet. What were the the people you were listening to back then when you were like playing guitar? Like, do you have any like influences you remember?
Yeah, man, it's like massively cringy too. It was like mostly Kirk Hammett from Metallica. That was like my idol guy, because I was like, oh man, how do I like play all these guitar solos? And I was like going through this book, which actually was called The Art of Kirk Hammett, which is where I got the name The Art of Mr. Bill.
Oh, like, interesting.
Yeah. And yeah, I was just like learning a lot of the solos and stuff out of that book, and that kind of gave me a lot of melodic ideas and stuff like that. Actually, I don't know. Would you even consider it like giving yourself a melodic idea if you just learn something somebody else does and then just apply it to your own music?
Actually, yeah, I definitely would. And that just specifically comes from my like history with jazz training and stuff. And the first thing that they tell you to do when you're learning like jazz is to go transcribe other people's solos. It's kind of like you can't learn to speak unless you've listened to people talk, right? So by replicating what other people are saying, you're learning bits and pieces of the language that you can then assemble together in your own way later once you have enough pieces of it. If that makes sense. So yeah, I think transcribing is extremely important.
Right. In that same way, do you think like reading a lot of literature allows you to have like maybe more complicated thoughts?
I think so. I think that makes sense.
It probably also allows you to like emotionally express yourself clearer too, right?
Yeah, well, I guess it comes down to like what kind of literature you're reading and like what you're reading it for. Because if you're reading like lots of different points of view on something, it's kind of like, I mean, compare it to the opposite, where if you only read one point of view on any subject, you'd be kind of biased towards that idea. But if you're really well read and you've heard a lot of different, opinions about something, it might give you a better like opportunity to kind of formulate your own opinions and thoughts about something, right?
Right. Or you could at least more honestly say to yourself that you agree with one over the others.
Yeah, by actually comparing and contrasting and stuff.
Right.
Classic. Word. So Metallica, you were like a metalhead. Did you listen to like other metal bands or anything?
Yeah, so it kind of started with that stuff, and then I guess like I was into all the classic like sort of popular grungy stuff, like Nirvana and Foo Fighters and I guess like Megadeth and Slayer and all that sort of shit. And then I suppose from there I got more into the progressive stuff like Dream Theater and
dude, yes, nice.
Yeah. uh, yeah, and I think like I got into all that stuff, and I thought it was really cool how it was like verging on like classical music almost, right? And I was like, oh, this is so cool. It's like, you know, all the melodies are like really intricate and complicated and whatnot. And then after a while, I just kind of grew sick of that. And what I started finding
Yeah.
interesting in music was like jazziness, because I was
Word.
like, I always thought like, oh yeah, the kind of counterpoint melodies and stuff. I thought they were really interesting for a while, and then I sort of just got sick of that stuff and started thinking like these really interesting dissonant chords at the end of phrases and stuff was like the interesting thing. And I feel like
Yeah,
that
that's
happened to a lot of people because it seems like all of a sudden like a bunch of producers turned like 20 and all started writing future bass, which was like pretty much sort of like jazz turnarounds in electronic music, right?
It's funny you say
yeah.
that. Yeah, because I have almost the exact same background as you. I basically grew up playing guitar. That's like my starting instrument. I played piano earlier for a couple of years, but no formal training really. And it's the same thing. Basically, the longer, you kind of start out with a genre and then you kind of keep exploring, and then you get into kind of more and more of the music theory. And coming from a position where you weren't taught it explicitly, you're kind of like exploring and figuring out all those new things. So I'm definitely in that group of people that turned 20. I don't know if I produced any future bass, but definitely changed the way I wrote music.
Yeah, it's funny that you mentioned Dream Theater too, because and also your progression with like falling in and then out of love with them, because the same thing happened to me. I remember I was super obsessed with them when I was in high school, and I had a couple of older friends who also used to be super into Dream Theater, and they're like, "Don't worry, you'll grow out of it." And me at the time, I'm like, "No way!" Like they're Berkeley trained musicians, they're the best. Like no one's better than Dream Theater. And then like eventually, I started to realize that there's a lot of music that's a little bit better than Dream Theater, and it's like some of it seems to be like more over the top just for the sake of like, look what I can do, more than it is like musical
Yeah,
taste,
it's like
right?
very nerdy. I think a big appeal to it from a lot of people who are playing instruments, especially people who like just got into playing instruments, they kind of see it from this perspective of like, oh, this is what happens if you play the instrument for like 20 years straight and don't like diverge from that task at all. And that seems impressive or whatever. But then you realize that a lot of people have played their instruments just as hard for 20 years or more and have not diverged from that task either, but they just have like more restraint in different ways. And I feel like the more mature you get with playing, the like more that you sort of subtly see that, and you sort of see the decisions that people are, instead of making, not making. Like you get these
Yeah.
crazy jazz people, and it's like instead of them deciding to go insane with these solos, they're deciding specifically not to, but to do it in their own like still extremely technical ways, but it just like has this like more sort of subtle and mature flair to it. Not that Dream Theater aren't amazing and mature musicians, but yeah, I don't know. I feel like just eventually you start. I mean, at least my experience was like that. I just started to look for more subtle things in music rather than the obvious shredding or whatever.
Yeah, well, I feel like Dream Theater specifically, like it's so much at one time that like especially as like a young musician growing up, like naturally it's going to be very intriguing, because like there aren't very many bands where you just get like a face full of solo for like 17 minutes per song, and each song is 17 minutes long. But yeah, like as you grow up, it definitely starts to become the same thing. Like if you compare it to like electronic music these days, it's like when you see a whole set of like nothing but insanely heavy nothing wall of sound the whole time, and it's like it starts to lose its impact really quickly without having like some juxtaposition next to it with like something that's a little bit more chill, or like something that's got a little bit more restraint in some areas, in order to actually accent those times when they do get super intense. Same with jazz
Yeah,
solos as well. It's
dude, I
same
agree.
thing.
And actually, I think the first time I ever like truly noticed this was when I went to this. I was looking at colleges to go to, right, in Sydney, and this college that I wanted to go to was called JMC Academy. I ended up going to SAE instead, which was sort of just like a competitor of JMC, I guess. But they both taught the same thing. They were sort of both music colleges, and they both did audio engineering as well. At the time, I wanted to go for music, and I went just to one of those open days that you can go to or whatever, and just sort of check out the college and like see some stuff there. And they had some performances by students there, And one of the
Oh, no.
performances I seen was just this dude who was just like playing chords on the guitar, like in some jazz piece. And I was like, oh, it's whatever. It's pretty easy. And then like it got to the solo part, and his solo was just like fucking insane. And I was like, oh wow, like that's actually just really mature playing. Like he could have just done that the whole time, and he chose not to because it would have been inappropriate. And then when it was his time to do it, he did like the perfect things, and it was really insane. But yeah, I agree. It's kind of like it's like that theory of power, right? It's like if everybody has power, then nobody has power kind of thing. But if it's the same with music for sure. Like the contrast, like if everything is shreddy, then nothing is shreddy, and like if everything is heavy, then nothing is heavy. And yeah, it's all contrast is a big deal, I think, in art. It's like you need to have these like contrasting blues with like purple, like grays or oranges. Like there needs to be like two very different things next to each other, otherwise it can just seem all like a bit homogenous and samey. Actually, Adam Neely was saying this on a podcast that I had him on a few weeks ago. He was saying what he tries to do a lot in music for writing B parts is just the opposite thing that he did for the A part. So if the A part is like, say, happy sounding and uses like a lot of open sounding stuff, like a lot of high frequencies and stuff like that, for his B part, he'll try and, make it sound very dark and sad and very subdued, like the polar opposite thing sort of.
Yeah, no, that's pretty smart, especially when you're like thinking about arranging music or whatever, because a lot of the time, trying to figure out what to do next, you end up sort of falling into like a stream of consciousness where it just kind of ends up being the same thing. And like a lot of the time sometimes I've experienced in many cases people sending me music or whatever, and it's like the other sections are not even different enough. Like they're almost different in a way, but like not enough to make it feel like the song really went anywhere. So yeah, just really finding a way to like juxtapose like certain ideas, and that's really smart, like really thinking about it almost literally in the harmonic context, because I think about it a lot in like the sound design context. It's like, okay, if something's mono, then make something else stereo, or if something's panning, then pan it left and right, or whatever kind of balance, lows and highs.
Yeah, Matt Zoe was telling me also in a podcast that I had him on a few weeks ago, that one thing he's tried to do in a few mixes before, just to contrast from everything else that he hears around, is how like a lot of electronic music, almost all of it actually, has like mono low end and very stereo tops. Yeah, he said like sometimes he'll try to make a mix where the entire range from like 500 hertz and up is all mono, and then everything below is like incredibly stereo.
Joel's gonna love this. He's the only person I know in the world who has a stereo sub set up in his room.
I don't.
How did you get the subs in time?
Subs in time. So what I use is, I don't actually know if they're in time. I just have my gear setup is I have two HS8s, so like the ones here, but those come out of a crossover. And that's like coming out of my main mixer, and then that crossover, I just take the low end and I send it it's in stereo to a left and a right set of speakers, and those are just getting like 60 hertz and below. Generally speaking, they're always just in mono.
But if you have two, it's not.
Yeah, they could potentially be slightly delayed, but I don't notice it too much. Speaking of which, I had a phase issue a while back that I did end up fixing, not just because I didn't have the high-end speakers going through the crossover, but technically speaking, they could be out. The only thing I do is just make sure they're the same distance from my head, and they're coming through the same amplifier, and they're going through the same crossover. So I'd imagine there's probably not too much difference, but it is possible that there is some phase issues there.
Yeah, so long as your room is symmetrical, it should be pretty much fine.
Yeah.
That was one thing I realized recently, is how important a symmetrical room is for stuff like that.
Yeah.
Because like if one of your walls is made out of, say, glass, and the other wall is made out of, say, wood, then both sides of your reflections are going to be completely different. It's going to fuck your stereo image up completely.
Yeah, well, I'm lucky. I'm actually in an attic. I don't know if you can really tell, but I've got angled roofs,
kind of tell, yeah.
And I've got about 30 feet back, so it's super symmetrical. There probably are some phase issues here and there, but yeah, it's interesting with having a stereo sub, because you can actually move left and right and feel like you can just run two sine waves and actually have them inverted, and you can't hear anything, but the whole house, you can actually hear the house shaking from the sine waves on the left and the right, but actually in the kind of the cancellation point, there's just nothing, which is nice. An odd feeling.
Yeah, fun experiment.
Not really worth. I mean, I got the speakers for free, so it's just like an extra $100 to get the crossover. But yeah, I mean, having a music like that with 500 hertz and below being stereo. I mean, I'm guessing that's mostly just an experiment though, because you can't really have that kind of stuff released.
Well, you could release it as just like whether or not people are going to be able to hear it on their end, but yeah, who knows? I mean, I don't know what, like, if streaming services are packing down the subs into mono or whatever, but yeah, it's still an interesting thought in the sense that it's just trying to contrast things differently, right? Like rather than do the thing that everyone's doing in terms of their thing or their mixes, just like do the polar opposite thing just to have something that sounds very different. I'll notice this actually when I'm just like clicking through SoundCloud, something like that, to try and find something that's cool. Usually the thing that will stand out to me is the thing that sounds very different. Even if it sounds like kind of fucked up and like not perfect and weird, I'll just like, that'll be the thing that stands out to my ear because I've just been listening to a bunch of homogenous stuff that all sounds the same for like 20 minutes straight,
Yeah. Well, I feel like that's kind of why lo-fi popped off for so long, but then it fell to the same, like lo-fi hip hop. It's like, okay, people are like, okay, we're not going to produce it that well. We're just going to have like the whole high end gone. But then at the same time, now all of that sounds all the same now as well. So it's kind of just a loop. Yeah.
Right.
Yeah, no, it's actually funny that you mentioned that. We had a similar conversation with AU5 about this because we were talking about like listening to music and like picking something out that's actually like stands out to you. And it's like, you could have 100 people send you like a really, really well mixed like replication of like all the good dubstep that you've heard over the past year. But then you get like one song sent to you where someone used like some super weird sounding snare. And it's like, that's the song you're going to remember, even if it's like not what might have been expected for that music. Like you hear this one sound. And I find that it definitely ends up being like a balance, because if like every single thing in the song is completely different, like you're going to hear it and be like, okay, this is all just a huge experiment, right? And so it kind of just, again, same thing as like if it's all heavy, it's nothing's heavy, right? If everything in it is experimental with no sense of familiarity, it'll just be seen as a gimmick. But then if there's like one or two things that are like imposed into something that you expect to be some sense of normality, it'll end up sticking out like really like a lot more than just sort of like your generic replication of sounds that you've heard before.
Right, yeah, you need to do the contrast stuff tastefully, otherwise it is just sort of the same as doing heavy stuff all the time or whatever. Like if you don't do it tastefully and you like overuse it, then it is no longer contrast, right?
Yeah, it's like the idea of a guitar, saving all your energy for the guitar solo where it's kind of meant to be. Like I feel like that translates directly to sound design, right? You don't always not every sound in your song should be the most complicated or different thing possible. You should choose those sounds, make them more complicated, more interesting, but have those be like the guitar solo in the song, right? And that's probably more for like I don't play guitar in most of my songs that often, so that's kind of more the domain that I'm spending most of my effort trying to like balance that out. Because a lot of times, you find a new technique or you fire up Faceplant, you're like, wow, this is super exciting, and you make a bunch of sounds out of it, and it's like you want to put them all in the song, but sometimes that's not actually the right answer.
Right, yeah. There's also this like effort on value thing too, where if you like put too much effort into a bunch of sounds, you'll be like sort of, you feel forced to use them a little bit, whereas if you put like no effort in, I always talk about this. It's something I notice myself doing fucking constantly, where I'll pull out a sample from a pack that's just like sample number 1 from Splice or some shit, and it'll work really well, but I'll always be like, that was like too easy, or like I feel cheap doing it because I didn't put enough effort into it or something like that.
Yeah.
And I was actually talking about this with a friend like yesterday or the day before, and he was saying that it's like important to feel a sense of ownership over the art that you make, because like for instance, he works in programming, right? And he was like, you can easily make stuff that just randomly generates anything, right? Like you can just randomly generate waves, or you can randomly generate MIDI, but you decide that it sounds like crap because it, maybe it adheres to some of the musical rules that we like, and maybe it doesn't. But one big component of why you would like probably never use it is because you just feel no ownership over it, and it's almost like feeling that sense of ownership over it is like a part of the sense of fulfillment of writing music in the first place.
Yeah, I guess it comes down to like where you draw the line, right? Because there's that whole I don't know if it's a meme or whatever you want to call it, but I remember there's like someone, don't use samples because they're, you didn't make them, and it's like, okay, well, I'll make all my samples from scratch, and it's like, well, don't use the synths in the DAW because you didn't make them. So it's like, okay, I'll open Max for Live, and it's like, well, don't use Max for Live because Ableton made that, so you start recording everything, and it's like, well, I didn't make this drum, so let me go cut down a tree, right? And it's like, where do you draw the line, right?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, for sure.
Well, I think it just depends upon what your idea is, because I think once you get a song to the point where it becomes an idea and it's unique in that, it really doesn't matter what you put into it. Obviously, it's, using the samples is like kind of the age-old thing about it. But once you have the idea in place, whether or not you're using, the drum loop that you found as kind of like scaffolding to build that idea, once you have that idea in place, then, I think that's where you have to try to take ownership for it, even though potentially there could be, some samples that you use to kind of get you going on that. Because, you can make all those drum loops yourself, but is it really worth that effort? It is, if in that case, it's if you want to feel that ownership for your music. But at the same time, if you can kind of get to that same point just by using the samples, then maybe you don't have to do that.
Yeah, I also feel like people just like draw that line in different places, right? That's why we have programmers, and then that's why we also have people who get their music ghostwritten for them.
Yep.
Yeah, yeah, fair. I guess the real question then is, where do you draw that line? What do you require in order to feel satisfied with the sound that you...
I'm inclined to say somewhere in the middle, but I probably err more towards the side of creating more of the stuff than most people do, I would say. Like, I develop my own sample packs. I teach people, I understand the software sort of back to front. I've built my own devices in Max before. I would say I err more towards the side of making things from scratch, but I also don't hate using samples from Splice or whatever, I do feel like I feel like it's cheaper personally, and I feel less fulfilled doing it, but I'll still do it sometimes because I can't lie to myself that sometimes the result of that is good and also fulfilling.
Yeah. Do you find that the reason why you're doing that, then the reason why you're making some Max for Live patch and trying to connect all the little connectors and whatnot, do you find that you're doing that because you're trying to find your own sounds? Is that kind of the driving force behind it? Or do you actually like just exploring that kind of stuff?
Honestly, I like exploring it. It's fun to me to have a challenge that I'm like, fuck, this is really difficult and I feel frustrated, but then figuring it out makes me feel really good. Yeah. So that feeling is a big reason that I enjoy doing that stuff sometimes. But secondly, it's usually got to do with the fact that it's almost every time that I want to manipulate MIDI data in such a way that isn't possible with the MIDI devices available. So I try to make a device that takes MIDI in some way and
does what you need.
Interpolates it in such a way, does some scaling or whatever the fuck I want it to do, and then spits out different MIDI data from the input.
Yeah, I did that. I went down the Max for Live rabbit hole about a year ago, and I've definitely spent. I'll want to make a device, and you start on Friday night, and then it's Sunday evening, and you're still got a lot of bugs, but you're like, I just spent 10, 15 hours on this trying to look up the documentation. I wish they had better documentation. It would be a lot easier if they had good forms.
Right, but it's fun, right? Like when you're stuck on something and you solve it, and you're like, holy shit, this works. It's really satisfying. It's kind of you can get that same thing from writing music too, like making a synth patch or doing a mix down. Like eventually when you nail a mix down and you're listening to it, it's very satisfying to listen back to, knowing that you took this thing that wasn't working and got it to work.
Yeah, no, I've definitely experienced that, where you're literally banging your head against the keyboard all day, and it's like all you need is to just go to sleep for a bit, come back with some fresh ears and start a mix again tomorrow, and everything starts working out, and you're like, oh, thank God. I don't know how many times I've had an existential crisis trying to finish a song before. It can be a nightmare every now and then.
Right. Definitely. Well, talking about Max for Live, I actually kind of I had a question that I'd prepared for you that is, you're obviously, you use Clifex Pro. I've seen a lot of your videos on that kind of stuff. I've been getting into that recently about live sets. just kind of to figure out, obviously that extends a lot of the functionality and like will save me from having to use Max for Live, because I try to avoid Max for Live. The more I've used it, the more I find it crashes my sets. So I generally kind of use it in some limited capacity. And what I'm wondering is, like, do you have a background with computers, or like before you jumped into Ableton, was there are you drawing from some other experience from prior to that, or do you just, when you get to a new application, you just kind of dive in head first and always kind of push it to the bottom?
Yeah, I mean, it's probably worth noting that I'm a terrible programmer. Okay. Like, I'm not good at it at all. Yeah. I live in San Francisco, so I'm surrounded by actual good programmers.
Yeah.
So I know where I fall on that spectrum, which is not good. And
subpar.
Yeah, super subpar at programming for sure. I understand conceptually how to program. I just don't understand a lot of the functions, and obviously it's just usually when you're learning a new thing in that realm, it's just about reading a lot of shit and Googling a lot of shit. And I mean, I'm okay in that area. I don't like reading a lot, to be honest. So that kind of makes learning that stuff a little tricky. It is just a lot of Googling and reading and comprehending a lot of new information quickly, it seems like, and just having really good search skills on the internet to find the information that you need. Yeah, and that's, I feel like, a big part of what being a good programmer is, and I'm not the best at that for sure.
Yeah. Well, and then on top of that too, if you go and try to learn to be a programmer, I went to school for it. I don't do it in my day-to-day job, but there's so much stuff that they tell you need to learn. And, bottom line is, if you can get that Max for Live plugin working and making the sounds you want, then it doesn't really matter. And a lot of the courses that you're going to find online are going to be like, hey, you need to learn this variable, this assignment, this and that. And really, that's one of the best things about Max for Live, in my opinion. You don't really need to worry about too much of that extra stuff. And a lot of the languages that are music oriented, they kind of skim past that and just let people actually be creative in almost like a musical way. Obviously, there are things that you have to bang your head against the wall against, like anything, but
right. Yeah, Max is very high level, so it's like different, for instance, than something like C or whatever.
Yeah.
But yeah, in terms of the background of like how I think this way, I was into electronics when I was younger, when I was like maybe, I don't know, from the age of like 13 to like 15 or 16, like a few years there, I was just like doing electronics at school. Plus my dad was into it as well. And so I would like get these kits from this store where it was just sort of like a breadboard kit, and you could just like build a thing on a breadboard and like get a circuit working and stuff like that. So I kind of learned the concepts of like how circuits worked and like what parallel versus series was and all of that stuff fairly young. And then that translated pretty well to synthesis.
Yeah, definitely.
And from there, I guess like when I reached the cap of, or not, I guess you can never really reach the cap of synthesis, but like when I learned a lot more about synthesis and electronic music production, I think like in the last maybe 4 years or 5 years is when I've started like hitting points where I'm like, okay, maybe I should start looking into like programming stuff here and there. But it's almost like once I start looking into it, like once I hit a wall with something and go, oh shit, I wish there was a tool for that.
Yeah.
It's not long after that something comes out solving that problem anyway. So it's almost like as a community in electronic music, a lot of people are hitting the same walls and realizing that there needs to be tools for it.
Yeah.
Then people who are just either more driven to have that tool or better programmers than I am are just building it anyway. And then I can just pay $100 to have it.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah, no, that's true. Cause like I considered diving into like the Max for Live stuff, but I find like the deeper you go, like, it's one thing to set aside a time to do sound design because it might derail you from finishing a song. But it's like, if you're working on a song, God forbid you open up Max for Live, because that is going to dilate time so hard that you'll never get back to finishing the arrangement. Like, it is so deep down there. So I just kind of just gave up on trying to assemble those things.
Well, you just ask me for the ones you want and I'll see if I can make it.
Well, it depends on your goals too, right? Like some people, the goal is the fun of building the device, right? Yeah. Whereas like other people's goals is just to have a piece of music finished and they don't care whether or not they wrote it. So, again, you have that spectrum of people who want to build their own tools because they think it's fun and rewarding versus people who would just be comfortable getting their music ghostwritten for them in the first place and have no like even desire to learn even a more high level thing like Ableton.
Yeah.
No, that's 100% true. So speaking
also,
about learning,
hold on, I wanted to add there as well. So my girlfriend is a really good programmer, right? And I was chatting with her the other day about programming, and I was like, oh, there needs to be a tool that like does this and a tool that does this, and like, why don't you write music through programming and stuff? And then we found this thing called Sonic Pi, which actually is a thing where you can write music through programming live. And she said to me, she was like, it just seems like a bit of a regression. And I think about writing music through programming, you eventually just build Ableton Live anyway.
Yeah.
Well, yeah, absolutely.
Have you heard of Pure Data? So that's I think that's pretty similar, right?
It's just like Max as well, right? Yeah. So Sonic Pi is different. It's actually like line-based code, and you can like write code in it, and it's like a sequencer that way. It's pretty interesting. It's worth looking into. But anyway, I just wanted to add that I think the more you start to think about making music tools, the more you realize that the main one, which is Ableton and other DAWs, have already sort of been created
and solve that problem.
Well, yeah, and they're also probably better than what you were gonna make too. It's like if I'm gonna like build a house, I don't make a hammer. I buy the hammer because there are people who manufacture those better than I can, right? So it's like I just get that, I buy the tools I need, and then I do the construction with the materials instead of trying to build all of my tools from scratch. Then you'll get the odd random thing where it's like if you have to cut a specific piece a certain way, it might be beneficial to build a jig for it, and that will be like a little custom tool that you have for something that you need. But like the core principles, like it's not really worth spending all the time. Like you said, like I don't want to write lines of code in order to sequence something when, like, if you really think about it, when I sequence something in Ableton is just writing that code into the computer, right?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, pretty much.
Yeah.
So curious, like, you have learned pretty much, like, I don't want to say everything, but like so many things about Ableton and production and stuff. Like, where did all the knowledge come from? Did you just like school of YouTube? Like, how long did it take you to learn so many things?
It was just a mixture of a lot of stuff. So I got into Ableton when I was pretty young. I would say, like, I mean, I'm 32 at the moment, so I got into it when I was like 18. So I've been into it for I guess almost like 15 years at this point. I got into it at a very early version, so there wasn't a lot
Live
of
one.
It wasn't Live 1. I got into it at Live 4.
Wow.
Or, sorry, maybe Live 5. But yeah, like a long time ago. And there just wasn't a lot there. And even still, when I got into it, I found it to be pretty overwhelming. But I mean, like, in terms of the devices, I have Ableton open here. If you look at the audio effects, there's like fucking 30 of them now or something. And if you look at the instruments, there's like 10 of those. And if you look at the MIDI effects, there's like 10 of those. And there's like a lot of devices now, and there's like a lot of functionality. So if you're getting into Ableton now, there'll be a lot to learn from scratch. Whereas when I got into it, there was like maybe 50% as much shit to learn. And so I learned it all. And then as the versions went on, I was able to learn the stuff as they added it. Yeah, exactly. And then secondly, I went to college for audio engineering, and I learned all the information in terms of audio engineering, mostly in terms of like Pro Tools and Logic, but a lot of that information I was able to translate over to Ableton, right?
Yeah.
And then I guess from there, I collaborated with a lot of people, and a lot of those collabs were done in person. And so sitting with someone and just like watching them work and just seeing little things that they do, it allows you to like pick up on just like little tricks, right? Where you're like, oh shit, you can do it that way. Like that's way faster than the way that I have been doing it or whatever.
Yeah.
And so in that sense, I feel like I picked up a lot of little workflow tricks and stuff like that. And then just obviously spending a lot of time by myself writing music and messing around, that also helped me a lot, I think, with just learning a lot of stuff. So I think it was like a combination of those things, and also school of YouTube for sure, like watching tutorials. And I'll still watch tutorials, honestly, like maybe once a week or twice a week. I'll like just see something pop up in my home feed on YouTube and be like, oh, that looks clickbaity and interesting, and I'll start watching it, and like 9 times out of 10 it's pretty interesting, and I'll learn a thing or two from it, or at least like it'll inspire me to like think about writing music slightly differently versus the way that I've been doing it lately, because I think that's also important, is like just not getting stuck in your ways too much.
Yeah. Well, yeah, if you want to grow, then definitely. Because, like, I know people who have their own preset patches and their default template, and, like, they can open up Ableton and write a song in 10 minutes, but it sounds the same as every other song they've written because they're just over again.
Which can be a benefit if you're trying to release, on a regular schedule and you want everything to be the same. But, it depends upon what your goal is. That said, like, you have one of the biggest discographies I've ever seen, and you're the kind of guy who seems to just do something different every single time. So, like, how do you manage to put out so much music and, like, constantly be doing something different? Like what is your thought process behind, like, what you're doing?
I mean, I just always try to do what I find fun if possible, and that just generally tends not to be the same thing all the time, because if I just keep doing the same thing all the time, it just starts to feel sort of like I'm just going through the motions, and it just starts to feel a bit boring and whatnot. So I try to always just keep it interesting by just trying new things. But also I stream a lot on Twitch, and honestly streaming on Twitch is a great way, I think, to sort of just look over at the chat and somebody be like, oh, you should try this, and I'll be like, oh yeah, sure, fuck it, like, why not, let's try that. Yeah. And then because I try that idea, somebody else will be like, oh, but what if you try this? And it's almost like I'm collaborating with a bunch of people who haven't agreed to be collaborators, but they're actually like triggering like all this extra stuff. Yeah exactly. It's like things that I wouldn't have thought to do, and maybe the thing that they said in the chat, because it's just one line of text or whatever, was not what they meant, but it like still triggers ideas in myself. So I don't know, I feel like that kind of helps a lot. Streaming for sure. Like I've honestly, like, streaming, I've gotten unstuck whilst writing so many times from just shit that people have said in the chat. Yeah. Right. So I feel like that's a good way to do something different every time. I feel like you can always get stuck in your head. Like if you're, imagine you're just writing by yourself. And you're like, I don't know if this sounds good. But if streaming is like the equivalent of having like 30 or 40 or 50 people just sitting on the couch behind you, saying things. Like run the vocal through distortion or whatever. Yeah. Or you turn your head and you just see like one of them starts nodding when you do something. It's like, that's all it takes. Like having just that little bit of extra feedback that just says, boom, okay, that's actually somebody else is reacting to that properly. And like, because that's going to happen, to everything you're trying out. Because when you're just kind of stuck in your own head, I know exactly what you mean. You can get in these ruts where you're like, am I even getting anywhere with this? And then when somebody else can help making that decision for you, it can just completely blow the dam out, and you just can start moving forward and figuring out what the idea actually needs to be. Right. I also find it funny that like when you're writing music by yourself in a studio or whatever, that quite often you're like thinking of a hypothetical audience that doesn't exist whilst you're writing. Yeah. Well, you're thinking like where it's going to get played, all the other songs you're trying, like if you're, if you have a reference track, you're trying to make it sound like that reference track, the people that would be listening to it there. Is that what you mean? Yeah, exactly. Or like, you'll be writing, say it's like a banger or whatever. You'll be like, oh yeah, like the dance floor would definitely go crazy to that bit or whatever. And it's just like, how do you know? Like you're writing it for a bunch of people in your head. Yeah, that's an interesting way to think about it. Yeah, I actually found one thing, like when I started streaming a lot more with music production, it's actually a really good way to be like semi-social and engaging with other people while doing something that most people would find like either monotonous or completely like boring or like even painful to watch. Because I mean, how many times have you sat there listening to the same like 3 or 4 beats of music over and over again, constantly pausing and restarting when it's like not actually even in time, and it's like, if I have physical people in the room with me, I feel like a inherent need to entertain them. And so I don't want to be like doing boring stuff, but I like the drive of having people watch me because it makes me focus. It makes me like, oh, like they're watching, I better show them that I know what I'm doing. So when I'm on like stream, it's like, yeah, if there's 50 people, like even if I didn't have the chat, just knowing that there's 50 people chilling and watching me, it's enough motivation for me to just be like, okay, like keep moving forward, just do something. And it really helps me like just kind of get into a zone. Right. But it's unfortunate that like, well, not unfortunate, but like just a fact, I guess, that the boring stuff is like the stuff that gets music finished, right?
Yep.
Whereas all the exciting stuff is kind of just like the what gets music maybe written quickly or whatever. So I often find like if I'm trying to finish a piece of music, I have to, if I'm streaming, like ignore the chat more, because they'll be like, oh, you should try this, and I'm like, no, I'm not like writing
there yet.
music on this. Like I'm trying to get this actually finished, not trying to go down like rabbit holes right now.
Yeah.
Whereas like in the writing process, you kind of maybe want to go down those rabbit holes a little bit more.
Yeah, and writing can be a more interesting process too, because you could be either playing an instrument or using a sequencer or something to generate ideas. Whereas when you're sitting there and mixing the drums, it's like, okay, you're just listening to all the drums individually for the next hour.
Right. And you're almost like listening to shit that like nobody would care about too, right? Like it's things that you know because you've maybe written a lot of music before will bother you a year down the line if you don't fix them. Yeah. But stuff that probably no one else will really notice because they're not going to listen to the song, you know, once
as many times as you ever.
Yeah, exactly. And like, you know, like somebody, I mean, I hear songs all the time that I love and I just don't listen to them that much, you know, like there's so many songs that I love at this point that I'll listen to it like once and then I might listen to it again a few weeks later and be like, oh yeah, that's a good song. Then I'll probably never listen to it again. But with my own music, it's like I listen to stuff that I wrote like 5 years ago again now, you know, just to like sort of, I guess, take stock of like where I'm at now versus then or something like that. And there's just so many things in it where I'm like, oh shit, I should have fixed all that stuff. And I'm sure I probably had like some semi thought back then of wanting to fix it or whatever and just made a conscious decision not to because I was lazy or whatever. And yeah, now I'm more conscious, I think, of trying to do that. But yeah, that's what makes like mixing sort of boring is now that I am making that conscious decision to like fucking fix all these like tiny little
little clicks and
whatever. Like pedantic little shit that probably no one gives a shit about and will never notice on their first few listens. I notice and it bothers me like years down the line.
Yeah. Oh, 100%. I've definitely experienced that before. And it's funny because like not to drop any names or anything, but I was doing a remix recently for a pretty well-known artist and I got their stems and there was like so many things in the stems that I'm like, oh God, like I could never live with all of these issues that I'm hearing, like just random clicks and pops and frequencies that were painful or whatever. But then I'm like, they were able to just say, you know, who cares? And because of that ability to sort of just like stop being a control freak and like OCD about it, it's like they definitely have way more music out than I do and they're much more successful than I am. So do you find that there's like a line that you sort of need to draw before it becomes like actually counterproductive to like be super OCD about everything?
Well, it depends on your goal, right? Because like counterproductive to what? If it's counterproductive to making a piece of music that I'll enjoy in 24 months time, then like maybe not. But if it's counterproductive to getting plays on Spotify next week, then maybe. So it really, I think, depends on just what you're trying to do. Yeah. Obviously, there's like a middle ground there, right? Like you want to have a career in music and you want to get plays on Spotify and you want to play shows and you want to have a nice discography that's constantly being updated and all of that cool stuff. But you also want to have music that you're proud of. So it's like definitely important to find that middle ground of both things, I think.
I think it definitely depends on where you are in your stage as well. Because if you're still learning and you think that, you know, obviously you'll always still be learning, but there's a certain point where, like you're saying, listening back to a song 5 years ago, you say, okay, I wouldn't have made those same decisions. I would have noticed that stuff. There's a certain point where there's really diminishing returns. You know, you feel like the music you make 10 years down the line, you'll still enjoy. Or maybe in my case, not hate. If I don't hate a song, then I generally think it's a good song because generally everything else I don't like after I've listened to it for the amount of hours I've worked on it. But, you know, for people that are first starting and whatnot, it's not, maybe not first starting, but, you know, 2-3 years into this, when they're still learning things, it's, you know, that sometimes it's not worth, obviously you're just learning every project, but going down those rabbit holes and fixing all the little things can be a good exercise in learning. But if you're already going to kind of toss the idea away, or you're just trying to get the song released, sometimes it's not worth doing that, going and doing all that extra work like you were saying. Yeah, I think it's just really, but I mean, the contrary is that, you know, you're 20 years into your career and you're writing your 8th album. It's like, well, you want to write the perfect album, or you want to write something that's going to top the other albums that you've written. So it's worth going down and doing every single little thing, or kind of focusing on the specifics a lot more in depth.
Right, but on the other hand, the opposite thought, or like a counter thought, exists there as well, where you're like, do I want to go so hard on my 8th album because then I have to write a 9th, right?
Yeah, right.
It's like, should I leave some room for growth here? Or
No, absolutely not.
Yeah.
And that's actually been a huge problem for me, because every time I finish a song, I'm like, the next one has to be better. And it's like, I'm barely able to one-up myself this time. And it's like, I'm getting to that point where it's like, what do I do now, right? Like, it gets scary, and it actually like slows down my process, because I start overthinking things, and then I just, I don't do things. And I also find that I have a huge problem with like having an idea in my head that I want, and I'm like, I want this song to sound like this, like before I even open the DAW. And I guess it seems to me like you come from an opposite side of that, where you tend to just sort of fuck around as much as you want, and then take whatever was cool and put it into a song. So like, what are your thoughts on the benefits of being like a more reactionary producer versus like a methodical?
I mean, I think there's benefits to both. I think being a methodical producer usually is like, you have having an end goal in mind is not bad. Especially, here's one thing I've noticed, specifically being in San Francisco around a lot of programmers, right, is with programming, you have to have an end goal in mind before you start. You can't go about it in this like creative, just like click around and see what happens kind of way. Like, you really need to think of the end product, and then you need to break down the problem systematically, step by step. You need to break up this big problem into smaller problems and stuff like that, and go about it systematically. But in the end, you have this like working program that can take care of a task properly, right? And like that's the goal, and you achieve the goal. And I feel the same way about music. It's like, if you go about it systematically, generally you're thinking about it in terms of like a problem, right? Like, and that problem might be, I need to have a heavier tune than everybody else to play on the dance floor, so I get the better crowd reaction. Or I need to have a song that sounds more like this genre, like lo-fi or something like that, than every other lo-fi song, so it gets playlisted more, and then I get more plays on Spotify than everybody else and make money, or something like that. So there's these goals that you can have. And yeah, you can of course break those problems down systematically by just making a mood board out of other pieces of music that exist already in that genre that are doing well, that you can objectify their worth by like plays on Spotify, or amount of fans on a dance floor, or things like this. And then you can go through step by step and break it down and recreate a piece of music that way. And there's nothing wrong with doing that. It's a especially good way to maybe go about it if you're trying to up your hit rate in your career, and just try and make money and get fans and all of that kind of stuff. But I would argue that it's, in my opinion, just doesn't feel as creative for me doing things that way as just going for it and just making a bunch of random shit and clicking around and seeing what happens, and coming out the other end with a maybe shitty piece of music that nobody wants to listen to, or a maybe very cool and unique piece of music that no one's ever heard before, right?
Yeah.
Well,
so, I guess, sorry, go on.
No, you're the guest, please.
I was pretty much done with my thought. I guess I was just going to wrap it up and be like, yeah, that's how I feel about it, I guess.
All right.
I did want to tie back into the software development kind of side of things, because there's essentially, in software, we're talking reactive versus like methodical. In software, it's called, like, they use the waterfall method, which means you start from the top and you do each component, like you map out the entire thing and you do each component individually, and then build the whole product. And it's like, you start from the very bottom and you just build your way all the way up. And you have like, models, and you plan the entire thing out. And then the other mode, which is more reactive, is called the iterative model, or like Scrum or Rapid. Like, that's kind of what a lot of people do these days. And the reason for that is because, generally speaking, when you build the first, product, or whatever you're saying, the first thing, it actually, your assumptions may have been wrong. So in actually writing that first product and creating essentially like a beta or like an alpha version of the product that you can get users using, that process essentially allows you to kind of identify any misconceptions you may have had about that idea. And so that's similar in music, where if you just write a song, you have an idea in your head, you just write that idea directly down, great, you've just done that, but you may have actually not understood the idea perfectly, and you may have actually wanted to change midway through as well. And so if you're more structured, you are limiting your ability to pivot in the middle of an idea because you're getting, stuck with the sounds that you've made or stuck with the packs.
Yeah, maybe a combination of both processes then is like the maybe ideal one, right? Where you are structured about it and know that you want to have an end goal that you can like quickly beta test, for lack of a better term.
Yeah.
And then after quickly beta testing an idea, you can be like, all right, that works or it doesn't.
Yeah.
And then maybe pivot and become more reactionary halfway through the process or something. And actually, I think that may be kind of how I work a little bit.
Yeah, just starting with a vague idea and then building from there and seeing where it goes.
I think so. I think I do that sometimes. Yeah, because sometimes I'll hear something, right, like a John Hopkins tune or a Tipper tune or just something, and I'll be like, "Whoa, that's fucking crazy," and I'll start like making something, or I'll be like, "Oh, I really want to like make something like that," and then like an hour into the process is when I'll do my pivot, right, where I'll just be like, "Oh, actually, it'd be cooler if it did all these other things," and then I'll diverge so much that it won't
be the same.
Yeah, it won't even really resemble the original thing at all too much, and yeah, I think that can maybe be a good process for sure.
Mm-hmm.
Well, a lot of that really speaks to me, just like the way that you iterated that there. And it's really interesting because, I mean, like, logically speaking, everything has to start from some idea. Like, whether you open Ableton, it's like, okay, the first thing you have to do is like, what am I going to do? Open operator? Like, making that choice or opening a sampler or whatever, like, that is a start of your method. Like, this is, methodically thinking, because you have to do something in order to generate sound at the beginning. But I guess the problem lies in like the more complicated and the more flushed out the idea is in your head before you start, the more you've already like kind of begun with yourself backed into a corner because you need to meet so many requirements in order to solve this problem that you had. And so that's what really like speaks to me a lot about what you said is like, with programming, you start with a problem, right? Because you're not going to start programming something without an idea of like, I need to solve this thing. Like I doubt that anyone just opens up any programming program and is like, I'm going to just write lines of code and see what happens. Like that doesn't seem like something that would ever exist. But when you were explaining that, the first thing I'm thinking is like, yeah, music shouldn't be a problem that you're trying to solve because that immediately removes creativity from the situation.
I would say that it gets rid of it entirely. It just limits. It essentially limits. It basically everything you add on. Like when you learn music theory and you're like a pro, you're like a pro jazz musician, you're way more inclined to use that because of, and essentially it's the sunk cost fallacy. The same thing as having that sample pack. When you have a sample pack, you're more likely to use that sample pack. When you have a bunch of presets, you're more likely to use those presets, which is not a bad thing, but it also then limits you. And so it's almost like you want to have these phases where you focus your sound, you figure out what it is, but then you also want to be able to make sure that you can then still break free of that when it's necessary, because all those things slowly kind of build up and kind of define what your sound is. And when you want to kind of reinvent yourself, you're going to have to basically throw a lot of that away or kind of pivot out from the sound you were originally going to something else.
Do you think that could go both ways though? Like, perhaps having these limitations, like I'm just going to write a lo-fi tune, for instance, when you've never written a lo-fi tune before, could be like a creative limitation to some degree, which could force you to have to think about your toolbox of tricks differently to apply to like this different set of music. Or like, if you're writing lo-fi hip hop, maybe you won't reach for Serum, or maybe you won't reach for like Operator, or maybe you'll like instead reach for something like Electric, which is something you may never use, right?
Yeah.
But or maybe you'll reach for Tension, like the something that I really never use that much, or something, and perhaps like by thinking of this genre that you've never worked on and like setting yourself this creative limitation, it like kind of forces you to think of different ways to achieve it. And I think creative limitation sometimes can be like really healthy, not necessarily like in the sense of I'm just going to write like a different genre of music, but rather creative limitation in the sense that maybe I will just limit myself to Tension for an entire song, like making the drums and everything using nothing but this one synth or something, I think those kind of thought processes can be healthy. And I think by having a somewhat systematic approach from the get-go can maybe somewhat guide you into these holes of creative limitation, maybe.
Yeah, and I think if anything, maybe I misspoke, but creative limitation can actually essentially allow you to innovate, because it's putting pressure on you, and it's taking you from being a 10-year producer to being like, I've never used this VST before. I don't actually have any clue what I'm doing. And that process of discovery is potentially going to help you, develop more interesting sounds, or kind of change your perspective, because when you open up Serum for like the 100th or the 1,000th time, you've got so much stuff in your brain that's wired to do the specific things. You set up the Serum here, you set that. And when you open up that program you've never used before, there's kind of probably, a 3 or 4 hour period there where you're just exploring and you have no idea what the knobs are. And you're turning stuff that you would never turn, years down the line, but that's where you can end up with some interesting things. Yeah,
right. Or you can also like generate some unfamiliar sonic results that can inspire you to make like different decisions halfway through the process that you wouldn't normally make. Because with Serum, it's like, you open it up, you load a wavetable, you turn the filter on. It's like it's going to sound like one of 5 different ways that it's sounded to you before, and having all those like preconceptions of what's going to happen and stuff before you even do it can definitely guide your decision a lot.
Yeah, especially Serum specifically is like, that's such a linear plugin, like just the way that the audio is routed, like it kind of just, it's really great for teaching people how signal flow works and stuff like that. But then when you're trying to do something different, like you said, like you're going to do this and then you're going to do this, because that's just the steps of building a Serum patch, make a wavetable, deal with the filter, then go to the effect, and then call it a day. So yeah, it is interesting. And I mean, I've seen even you actually go as far as to just opening a new DAW to try and to do some stuff. You were messing around with FL Studio just recently. What inspired that?
Well, originally it was supposed to be a collab video on YouTube with Ben Jordan, the Flashbulb. So he was supposed to do, he actually did release his video, which was a comprehensive review of Ableton by a Fruity Loops user. And I was supposed to do a comprehensive review of Fruity Loops from an Ableton user perspective. And I guess like my thought at the end of the week, because we allowed ourselves like a week, right, to do it. Mm-hmm. At the end of the week, his thoughts and my thoughts were basically the same, but he decided to do a video with his thoughts and I didn't. And the thought was basically, a week is not long enough to learn a new DAW and objectively have an opinion of it. Like my opinion of FL is that it's an extremely deep program that's been developed on for like 20 years now. And there's just menus upon menus upon menus of shit that I just don't have the time to go into in a week. And I just didn't see the point in making a video where I was like, oh, so there's probably, I have a bunch of problems with this program and there's probably solutions for all of these problems, but I don't know what they are because I spent a week using the program. Therefore, like, my opinion is sort of invalid, right? Until I use the program for maybe 6 months straight or like a year straight. So I can be like completely aware of like where all of its actual limitations are. At which point, like, I will be used to working around the limitations anyway. So it's kind of like every day.
Yeah, eventually you're basically just using another DAW. It's not going to matter anymore, right?
Well, and sometimes those creative limitations may actually make you a better producer. So the things that are actually blocking you out of, they say, okay, this is all you can do with the program. That may actually be helping you. It may actually help your process. It's hard to measure that until you've learned the program and written a song with it.
Yeah, well, I did actually write a song with it. Like, I got a finished piece of music written, which took, like a week to do. And it was frustrating as hell. And, like, I found a lot of stuff about the program that I didn't like. But all the stuff I found that I didn't like, I asked other producers about it. And they were like, oh, yeah, you just shouldn't use FL that way. It's sort of designed to be used this other way.
Yeah.
And then when I started messing around a little bit and using it this other way, I was like, oh, yeah, it kind of just behaves mostly like Ableton. And that's when I realized... I can't make a video on this because I'm just going to get ripped apart in the comments of people being like, you're a fucking idiot, you don't know what you're doing.
You don't know this.
Yeah, why bother like trying to review something you just clearly don't understand and stuff like that. So I was like, what use is it me making a video being like, hey, here's a thing that I don't understand because I only used it for a week. That's my opinion. It's like people are going to look at
all my knowledge from Ableton.
Yeah, people are going to look at that video and be like, of course, that's a fucking normal opinion to have. Why even upload this video? Yeah. So that was why.
Yeah, that makes sense.
Yeah, that's why I didn't do my video. But
I think
Ben's
that was a
video,
smart call.
Yeah, Ben's video was great though. I thought his video was good. He didn't like get stuck on so much, and I I mean, this might be like a weird opinion to have, but I just think that's because Ableton's an easier program to use, to be honest.
That's what I was just gonna say.
Yeah.
I'm like, maybe he didn't get stuck on it because Ableton's kind of intuitive that way.
I actually watched the video, and the one thing that I actually disagree with him about, though, was he talked about Max for Live, and he brought up, he's like, if I want to do something, I don't have to build the plugin for it. And I think the one thing he got wrong is you don't have to half the time. Like you're saying, people have solved all of these problems. All you have to do is go to maxforlive.com and do a bit of searching, and you're ending up with pretty much every tool you want. And it's from my perspective, that's probably the feature that changes the fact that
give
it's
him a break, man.
Yeah.
He only used the program for a week.
Yeah.
Right. But also Fruity has this thing in it called Patcher,
Yeah.
which is
Oh yeah.
sort of like Max
It's
for
pretty
Live.
similar.
Yeah. I mean, Bitwig has the grid, and a lot of Logic has the environment. Like there's a lot of this kind of thing happening in each and every DAW now, where you have this sort of like modular sort of node-based programming thing going on. Like even video programs have it now. Like DaVinci Resolve has that like color editing area with all the nodes and stuff. So
Yeah.
I think like that's pretty standard for a program to have at this point. And I don't think it's like an arguing point for a strength or a weakness now, because all programs kind of do it.
Yeah.
Although I will say that I think Max is like pretty damn functional in comparison to the Patcher or the Grid or whatever. It's like,
It's just pretty
Max
mature. Yeah.
yeah, I mean, like the Grid was something that was developed over the last like 2 years or 3 years, and Fruity Patcher is something that was just sort of built on top of Fruity. I mean, so Max for Live was also just added to Ableton like late in the game, but Max, independent of Ableton, was developed by a whole other company for also
Right.
like 20 years, right? So
Yeah.
yeah, I don't know. I'm biased because
I think all three of us are.
yeah, but I mean, having said that, there was a reason why I landed on Ableton of my DAW of choice 15 years ago, and that's because 15 or 12 or however many years ago it was that I was choosing between DAWs, because I tried all of them, right? Like when I was trying to get into electronic music, I was sort of trying to figure out which one gelled with me the best, and it was
Right.
Ableton by far, because I agree, it's just intuitive.
Yeah.
And every other program, including Fruity, which I did use back in the day, I just couldn't like in my head figure out how everything worked very easily. Whereas with Ableton, it was almost like using an Apple product versus using like Linux or something, right? Whereas using like
Yeah.
Linux or Windows, you kind of have to, if I want to like reset my password or some shit on Windows, I almost have to Google it every time to figure out how to do it. Whereas
Yeah.
like on iPhone or something, I just sort of like click around and figure out how to do it.
Yeah, it guides you in the right direction.
Well, they limit the options you have, and they do that so that it's easier to understand. So instead of having, you click on a menu and there's 30 different options that can do everything you ever want, instead of having that click up menu, they just have, 5 options, but they're shown to you all at the same time. And you can do less things, but at the same time it can be more powerful because they made that decision for you. So it's kind of that balance. But at the same time, that's definitely, Ableton has a massive amount of depth still on top of all of that. And you can just add a VST if you really want to. Just add phase plant, and you're off to the races if you really want to get complicated.
Right. It just seems like better UX for sure.
Yeah.
That's kind of how I felt with Fruity. Is it felt like they had something that was like a drum sequencer, like 20 years ago, that was just like some weird step sequencer thing, and then they just kept building on it and building on it and building on it and like adding layers to it, and it really feels like 3 DAWs in one, and it really feels like there's just endless menus, right? Like
Yeah.
if you just click somewhere like in the piano roll is insane in Fruity. That's one thing that I'll credit it for.
Yeah, I've heard that they've got a good piano roll. I don't know enough about it.
It's so cool, man. It's really cool. But it's just crazy because like you'll click on a menu in the piano roll and it will open up like another menu which has another big menu, and then another menu inside that which has another big menu. And that was one thing that Ben was explaining to me when we were chatting at the end of the whole process, is he was just like, man, I'm just used to like seeing these endless menus where I can just keep going in and editing stuff at a deeper, more root level. And I was like, yeah, but I agree with you in the sense that that's just bad UX, because it's like, yeah, sure, like maybe once in a while you'd want to access that stuff, but at the end of the day, it really kind of just gets in the way a little bit, I think. And that might also just be because I'm not used to it,
And it depends on what you're using it for. If you're not doing, I think really writing, that process needs to have the least amount of inhibitions. You need to basically be able to just get your idea down as quickly as possible and have as many things within arm's reach. And that's why most people build their studios and they have like all their guitars all wired up and make it as easy as possible. So when that idea does come, they can just get it down. But at the same time, you also, if you're just doing very, very technical mixing, you already know what you're going to do. It's the same thing every time. If you're mixing like a rock album and you got 10 tracks, you got to do the same thing to each of them. Having that flexibility might be the best option. But another thing to keep in mind as well is with a company like Fruity Loops, or really any of these companies, when they develop the user interface at the very beginning, they now have this huge user base, which will scream at them and yell at them if they make any changes to it. So that's probably why they just tack on a new UI on top of the existing ones, because if they tear that, if they redo the UI, which is something that Apple will do, because they're just brave enough to say whatever, our users will just deal with it, which is smart because down the line it actually solves the problems. But at the same time, it's like a question that every software company has to deal with. It's like, do we tear up everything and have all of our users really mad? Or
the issue with DAWs doing that, and less so than something like Apple, maybe. Well, actually, that's not true, because every time Apple does this, it like breaks everyone's audio interfaces and stuff.
Oh god, yeah.
But the problem with doing that in a DAW like Fruity Loops or Ableton or something is that like people are working on large art projects, you know, and like if there's somebody who's still on like Ableton 10 and for whatever reason they want to upgrade to Ableton 11 because there's some new feature in there, but it breaks all of their side chaining or something, or like breaks all of their automation, or like unlinks all of their fucking automation from every plugin in the session, or like because Ableton decides to redevelop how automation works or something like that, or fucking unwarps every clip in every session or something like just some crazy
hurting me to hear you talk about this.
Well, this is the reality, right? Is if they change the way that warping works, or they change the way that automation works, if you upgrade, it's possible that like it could break it for all your other sessions. And then what? Like you need to sort of just stay on version 10 until you're finished working on all those sessions, or just accept the fact that it's all broken and like rebuild those sessions, or there's like a bunch of shit to think about for sure from a user experience perspective when developing software at that level, for sure.
Well, speaking of Apple, they just, I don't know if you know, they released a new ESX24. They switched the sampler entirely. And like all the people that used the sampler before are just like absolutely furious, because if you upgrade to the new version, you just don't have ESX24 anymore, which to be fair is a plugin out of like 2005. But
but some people use it.
Yeah.
I mean, I heard that that was like Tipper's main sampler. He came to my studio once a few years ago.
That must have been fun.
Actually, it was like last year or something. Yeah, it was awesome. And he kind of just wanted to sit with me whilst I used Ableton all day, just and like ask me questions as I was doing it, just so he could kind of be like, here's something that I do in Logic, how would I do it in Ableton, sort of thing, to like kind of get his head around Ableton a bit better.
Yeah.
And a lot of the questions he was asking me is how to do EXS24 stuff in Sampler. And for a lot of it, I had solutions. But some of the stuff he seemed to like to do in there, I can't remember any particular things off the top of my head, seemed to be things that just weren't possible in Sampler, or you had to do it a very different way.
Or like multi-sample mode or something. It's very similar to Kontakt, actually. In some ways, It's got a lot of similarity to that. But at the same time, I mean, once you learn the interface, it's not bad, but it's not I don't know if you looked at it. It's not there's not only a limited number of modulators, and it's just it's just an old program. But
I might be wrong about this, but I'm almost certain that I've heard before that you can open up what is it, EXS24? Is that what it's called?
I think it's ESX24.
Yeah, I've heard that you can actually use those in Kontakt, but I don't know if that's correct.
That would be cool. I mean, I'd have to take a look at that afterwards. But I actually started in Logic probably 6 or 7 years ago. And then when I met Mike, he was like, you should just try Ableton. And I think my production sucked for like 3 months, but then I immediately surpassed what I was doing before. And I've just never looked back since.
Yeah, I feel the same. I mean, I'm trying to convert my artist Funny at the moment from Logic to Ableton, because I like to work with him on collabs a lot.
Yeah.
And he just always he's still is like a Logic user, but I'm slowly getting him onto Ableton. And I think it's hard to make the jump from one DAW to another, especially if you've got a lot of work in one DAW.
Yeah.
For instance, like a lot of people ask me about Bitwig, right? Because I kind of like half switched to Bitwig for like a few months. and I started a bunch of projects in there, and I did a few remixes in there. Like my Dead Mouse remix was done in Bitwig, and a few tracks that I released have been done in Bitwig. And then I kind of stopped and went back to Ableton, and so many people were like, why did you go back to Ableton? And I don't know, the reality is just because I have so many racks saved in Ableton that just saved me so much time that I couldn't be bothered figuring out how to rebuild in Bitwig. And I just have so many collabs with so many people in Ableton that I don't want to have to rebuild all those sessions in Bitwig. And just like not a lot of people use Bitwig, so if I want to do a collab with somebody else, like, and that happens quite often, 90% of the time they use Ableton. So it's like I don't want to have to just be half in Ableton and half in Bitwig all the time. It seems just to be like confusing. And so I don't know, I just kind of like, I use Bitwig sometimes. For instance, last week I did a big stint on the grid. I've been enjoying the grid a lot, actually. It's kind of fun. Just modular synthesis in general. I also really enjoy reactor blocks and stuff.
Yeah, I did a lot of reactor a while back, but I had so many troubles with it saving files and just erasing. I would make like a really cool, it's basically like a modular. I'd spend all this time making a really cool patch, and then next time I load it up, it's all gone. So hopefully I recorded to audio. So yeah.
Hey, I should probably run because I need to go do some grocery shopping, and then actually I have to brew some beer. So my quarantine hobby has been brewing beer.
Oh, nice.
If you don't start early enough, it doesn't get done.
Definitely.
Word, man. Well, thank you so much for coming. We have tons of questions we didn't get to, but that was kind of expected. We'd love to have you back if you're ever down to come on again, but definitely super appreciate you taking the afternoon to come hang with us.
Yeah. Awesome, man. Yeah, I'd love to. I'll send over this audio as well after we get off the call, and I'll just email it to you, Mike, and then you'll have it.
One quick question before you leave, though. Is that waveform behind you, is that the Amen break?
Yeah, it is. Yeah.
Yes, we got.
Dude, he knew it. That's so funny. I was like, that looks like a waveform, and I was like, it looks like a drum beat, and I was trying to sing it, and instantly Joel's like, what if it's the Amen break? That's so funny.
Yeah. We were wondering when you stepped away to get a glass of water. So yeah.
Yeah, you can get it from Etsy. Yeah. There's some guy who like laser cuts them out of wood. I saw it and I was like, dude, that's the sickest shit. I need to get that.
Oh yeah, I want to get a lathe now just so I can like print a waveform of whatever and just like carve it out and tell someone it's the Amen break, but it's actually me going like, yo, what up, bitch?
Yeah, I should get a think break or something. I should get a bunch of different breaks and like have them all on the wall.
Yeah,
they actually probably
you find a way to play it.
You
find a way to like put it through like a conveyor belt over like a really big needle or something.
Yeah, I feel like I feel like they'd probably act as good diffusers if you got a bunch of them and hung them on a back wall.
Yeah. If you made them out of metal, you could use a theremin to play it.
That's a good point. Yeah, or a violin bow or something.
Yeah.
I wonder if you ran a convolution nullifier over it, would it reflect the Amen break back?
Yeah, that'd be interesting.
Anyways, we really appreciate you coming on. We know you got to go, so have a good time brewing beer, and thanks so much.